Your first week caravanning is something you never really forget because before you leave, you imagine what it's going to feel like: freedom, adventure, relaxation. And while some of that is true, there are also a lot of little things no one really explains beforehand. And if I'm being honest, my first week caravanning felt very different to what I expected. Not bad, just different, because suddenly everyday life changes. You're sleeping in a different environment, driving differently, living in a smaller space, thinking about things you normally never think about. And during that first week, your brain is constantly adjusting. I remember the first morning after arriving somewhere new and realizing how unusual everything felt at first. Even simple things, making coffee, finding things in cupboards, getting organized. Nothing felt difficult exactly, but everything felt unfamiliar. And that unfamiliarity is what surprises most beginners, because caravanning is not just travel, it's learning a completely different rhythm of living. Now, here's the interesting part: the first few days often feel mentally busier than people expect, because even when you're relaxing physically, your brain is processing a lot: where things are stored, how setup works, driving routines, power, water, simple daily systems. I remember noticing how mentally tired I felt after some of the first setup days, not because anything was going wrong, but because everything was new. And that's something beginners don't always expect. Now, let's talk about space, because this is one of the biggest adjustments during your first week. At home, you're used to spreading out naturally, but inside a caravan, everything becomes more intentional: where you place things, how you move around, how organized you stay. I remember realizing very quickly that small messes feel much bigger inside a caravan. And that's why routines become important very fast. Now let's talk about mornings, because mornings caravanning feel very different from normal life. There's a slower pace to everything. You wake up somewhere different. The air feels different. The environment feels different. And I remember having moments during that first week where everything suddenly felt incredibly peaceful. Just sitting outside early in the morning, hearing birds, hearing the quiet around me, and realizing how different life felt when everything slowed down. And honestly, those moments are a huge part of why people fall in love with caravanning. Now let's talk about driving during that first week, because this is where beginners usually feel the most pressure. Every drive feels like a learning experience: fuel stops, turning, parking, watching mirrors constantly. I remember arriving at destinations feeling mentally exhausted at first because towing required so much concentration. But what surprised me was how quickly improvement happened. Every drive made the next drive easier. Every setup made the next setup smoother, and confidence started building much faster than I expected. Now let's talk about weather, because weather suddenly becomes much more important when you're caravanning. Wind, rain, heat, cold mornings. You become very aware of conditions in a way most people never experience living in a house. I remember my first windy night hearing movement around the caravan and thinking something was wrong. But eventually, I realized that caravans naturally respond to weather differently. And once I understood what was normal, it stopped bothering me. Now let's talk about expectations, because this is one of the biggest mindset shifts during your first week. A lot of beginners imagine caravanning like a permanent holiday, but real caravanning still involves everyday life: cooking, cleaning, organizing, planning. The difference is that all those things happen in different places at a slower pace with a very different atmosphere around you. And honestly, that's what makes the lifestyle so unique. Now let's talk about confidence, because confidence changes dramatically during the first week. At the beginning, everything feels uncertain. By the end of the week, many things already feel familiar. And that transformation surprised me more than anything else. I remember realizing after just a few days that I wasn't overthinking every small thing anymore. Setup became easier, driving became calmer, the caravan started feeling normal. And that's an important thing for beginners to understand. The hardest part is often just the adjustment phase. Now, here's something else that really surprised me during my first week: how quickly you start simplifying your life. You realize very fast that you don't actually need as much as you thought. Simple meals become normal, simple routines become enjoyable, and life starts feeling less cluttered mentally. I remember noticing how much calmer my mind felt once I adapted to the slower rhythm of caravanning. And honestly, that's one of the biggest benefits people rarely talk about. Now, here's the key idea for this first part: your first week caravanning is not about perfection, it's about adjustment, learning, settling into a completely different way of living. And once you stop expecting everything to feel instantly normal, the whole experience becomes much more enjoyable. Now that we've talked about the adjustment phase and how mentally different the first week can feel, let's move into some of the things that really start changing once you settle into the lifestyle a little more. Because this is where caravanning becomes very interesting emotionally. At the beginning of the week, most beginners are focused on doing everything correctly, checking things constantly, overthinking setup, double checking every decision. But somewhere during that first week, something slowly begins to shift. You start relaxing, and I remember noticing that change very clearly. At first, every setup felt like a process I had to think through carefully, but after a few days, I started doing things more naturally. And that's when caravanning started becoming enjoyable instead of mentally exhausting. Now, let's talk about routines, because routines develop incredibly fast when you're caravanning, and honestly, they make life much easier. Where shoes go, where chargers stay, how you organize food, what order you set things up. I remember realizing that small routines removed so much stress, because once your brain stops constantly making decisions, everything feels calmer. Now let's talk about meal times, because this is another thing that feels very different during your first week. At home, meals are often rushed and automatic, but caravanning changes that. Everything slows down, and even simple meals somehow feel more enjoyable. I remember cooking very basic food during my first week and still feeling strangely satisfied. Not because the meals were special, but because the whole environment felt different. You're outside more, you're present more, and simple things suddenly feel more meaningful. Now let's talk about time, because your relationship with time changes dramatically during your first week caravanning. At home, life often feels scheduled and rushed, but caravanning naturally slows things down. You stop racing from task to task. You start noticing your surroundings more. And honestly, that slower pace can feel strange at first. I remember almost feeling guilty relaxing during my first week because I was so used to constantly doing things. But eventually I realized that slowing down was actually one of the biggest benefits of the lifestyle. Now let's talk about little frustrations, because beginners sometimes think experienced caravanners never deal with problems. But small frustrations are completely normal: misplacing things, awkward setups, forgetting simple items. I remember having moments during that first week where tiny problems felt much bigger than they actually were. But eventually I realized something important: most caravan problems are temporary and manageable. And once you stop treating every small issue like a disaster, the whole experience becomes much more relaxed. Now let's talk about social interactions, because this is something beginners don't always expect. Caravanning communities are often incredibly friendly. I remember being surprised by how willing people were to help beginners. simple conversations, helpful advice, friendly gestures, and that support makes the adjustment period feel much easier because you quickly realize you're not alone in learning all this. Now, let's talk about sleeping because sleeping in a caravan feels very different at first. New sounds, different temperatures, different routines. I remember waking up several times during some of my first nights simply because everything felt unfamiliar. But what surprised me was how quickly my brain adapted. After a few nights, it already started feeling normal. And that's an important thing beginners should remember. Your comfort grows much faster than you expect. Now, let's talk about organization because organization becomes incredibly valuable during your first week. Not perfection, just simple organization, knowing where things are, putting things back, keeping surfaces clear. I remember realizing that staying organized inside a caravan dramatically reduced stress because in a smaller space, clutter affects you much faster. And once you develop good habits early, caravanning becomes far easier long term. Now, let's talk about freedom for a moment, because somewhere during that first week, you usually experience a moment where everything suddenly clicks emotionally. Maybe it's waking up somewhere beautiful, maybe it's sitting outside quietly in the evening. Maybe it's driving somewhere new and realizing you can simply choose where to go next. But eventually, there's a moment where you truly understand why people love this lifestyle. I remember having that exact feeling during my first week, a quiet moment where I realized life suddenly felt simpler, less rushed, less noisy mentally, and that feeling stayed with me. Now let's talk about the learning curve one more time, because beginners often underestimate how quickly improvement happens. The first setup feels difficult, the fifth setup feels manageable, the first drive feels stressful, the fifth drive feels familiar. And that rapid growth in confidence is one of the most rewarding parts of the first week. I remember being surprised by how capable I already felt after just a few days, and that's because experience teaches faster than overthinking ever can. Now, here's the key idea from this part. Your first week caravanning is a transition period. You are not just traveling, you are adapting to a completely different lifestyle rhythm. And once you stop resisting that adjustment and start embracing it, caravanning becomes far more enjoyable. Now that we've talked about routines, adjustment, and how your confidence changes during the first week, I want to move into something deeper. And that's how caravanning starts changing your mindset surprisingly quickly, because this is something I genuinely did not expect when I first started. I thought caravanning would mostly change where I traveled, but what surprised me was how much it changed how I felt day to day. And honestly, that shift started happening during the very first week. I remember noticing how different my mind felt once life slowed down. At home, everything often felt rushed automatically. Wake up, check your phone, think about work, think about responsibilities, move quickly from one thing to the next. But caravanning interrupted that rhythm completely, and at first that actually felt strange because slowing down is harder than people think, especially if you're used to constantly being busy. I remember catching myself wanting to rush simple things during that first week: packing, cooking, driving, even relaxing. And eventually I realized something important. Caravanning was teaching me to slow down mentally, not just physically. Now let's talk about simplicity, because one of the biggest things that happens during your first week is you start noticing how little you actually need to feel comfortable. Simple meals, simple routines, simple environments, and yet somehow life often feels more enjoyable. I remember being surprised by how satisfying basic things became: morning coffee outside, quiet evenings, simple camp setups, and that simplicity created a kind of mental clarity I wasn't expecting. Now let's talk about being present, because caravanning naturally pulls you into the present moment more often. At home, it's very easy to constantly think ahead. Tomorrow, next week, work, responsibilities, but caravanning changes your focus. You start paying attention to where you are right now. The weather, the scenery, the atmosphere around you. I remember noticing during my first week that I was thinking less about everything else and paying more attention to what was directly in front of me. And honestly, that felt incredibly refreshing. Now let's talk about uncertainty, because one thing beginners often struggle with during the first week is uncertainty around small things. Am I setting up correctly? Am I driving properly? Am I forgetting something? I remember constantly second guessing myself early on, but eventually I realized something. Most caravanning confidence comes from repetition, not certainty beforehand. And once I accepted that, I stopped putting pressure on myself to know everything immediately. Now let's talk about emotional ups and downs, because honestly, your first week can feel emotionally mixed sometimes. Excitement, stress, freedom, fatigue, confidence, uncertainty, and all of that is completely normal. I remember having moments during my first week where I felt incredibly relaxed, followed by moments where small problems suddenly felt overwhelming. But over time, those emotional swings settled down as everything became more familiar. And that's important to understand. Adjustment takes time. Now, let's talk about expectations versus reality again, because social media often shows caravanning as permanently perfect. Beautiful campsites, perfect sunsets, relaxed people. And yes, those moments absolutely exist, but real caravanning also includes rain, messy setups, forgotten items, fatigue, and learning curves. And honestly, understanding that made me enjoy the lifestyle much more, because once you stop chasing perfection, you start appreciating the experience itself. Now, let's talk about confidence one more time, because the confidence you build during your first week goes far beyond towing or setup. You start trusting yourself more. You realize you can adapt. You realize you can solve problems. You realize unfamiliar situations are manageable. And that self trust becomes one of the most valuable parts of the experience. I remember finishing my first week feeling very different from when I started. Not because I suddenly became an expert, but because I realized I was capable of learning, and that changed everything mentally. Now let's talk about connection, because caravanning often reconnects people with things modern life pushes aside: nature, quiet, conversations, slower mornings, less screen time. I remember noticing during my first week how much more aware I felt of simple things around me, and honestly, that awareness felt incredibly calming. Now, here's something important beginners should understand. Your first week is not supposed to feel completely polished. It's supposed to feel like a beginning, a transition, an adjustment into a different way of living and thinking. And once you stop expecting perfection and start embracing the process, the whole experience becomes much more rewarding. Now, here's the key idea from this part. Your first week caravanning changes far more than your location. It changes your pace, your mindset, your routines, and often your perspective on what actually matters day to day. Now, as we bring everything together, I want to leave you with something that I genuinely wish I understood before my very first week caravanning. You are not supposed to feel completely comfortable immediately. And honestly, understanding that removes so much unnecessary pressure. Because I think a lot of beginners secretly expect themselves to instantly settle into caravan life perfectly. Perfect setup, perfect routines, perfect confidence, perfect relaxation. But real caravanning doesn't work like that. It's an adjustment process. And that adjustment is actually part of what makes the experience meaningful. I remember during my first week constantly analyzing how I was doing, Was I setting up correctly? Was I organizing things properly? Was I driving well enough? But eventually I realized something important. The people who enjoy caravanning most are not the people who do everything perfectly. They're the people who learn to relax into the experience, and that changes everything. Now let's bring everything back to the key ideas from this video. Your first week will probably feel mentally busier than you expect. Everything is unfamiliar at first. Driving requires more concentration. Small routines take time to develop. Sleeping feels different. Living in a smaller space takes adjustment, and all of that is completely normal. But what surprises most people is how quickly those unfamiliar things start becoming familiar. That's the part nobody really explains beforehand. The first setup feels difficult, then suddenly, a few days later, it feels manageable. The first drive feels stressful, then suddenly, towing starts feeling more natural. The caravan starts feeling less like something unfamiliar and more like your space. And that transition happens far faster than most beginners expect. Now let's talk about slowing down one more time, because honestly, this might be the biggest lesson caravanning teaches people. Modern life trains us to rush constantly. Rush mornings, rush meals, rush conversations, rush relaxation, but caravanning naturally interrupts that pattern. And during your first week, you start realizing how different life feels when you stop rushing everything. I remember having quiet moments during my first trips where I realized my mind felt calmer than it had in a very long time. And honestly, that feeling stayed with me long after the trip ended. Now let's talk about mistakes, because beginners often become discouraged by small mistakes during the first week, forgetting things, awkward reversing, messy setups. But those moments are not failures, they are experiences, and every experienced caravaner has gone through them. That's important to remember. Nobody starts confident, nobody starts experienced. Everyone learns through doing. Now let's talk about enjoyment, because once the adjustment period settles down, something really beautiful starts happening. You stop focusing so heavily on doing caravanning correctly and start actually experiencing the lifestyle. The slower mornings, the quiet evenings, the freedom of movement, the simplicity, the connection with nature. And eventually, you realize that caravanning is not really about the caravan itself. It's about how differently life feels when you slow down enough to actually experience it properly. I still remember finishing my first week and realizing something surprising. I didn't feel like an expert, but I no longer felt like a complete beginner either. And that middle ground is where confidence starts growing. Because confidence is not perfection, it's familiarity, it's experience, it's self-trust built over time. Now, here's something I really want every beginner to remember. You do not need to have everything figured out before you start caravanning. You just need the willingness to learn as you go, because the lifestyle teaches you incredibly quickly once you actually experience it. And honestly, that learning process becomes part of the adventure itself. So if you're about to head off on your first caravan trip, keep things simple. Take your time, allow yourself to adjust naturally. Do not pressure yourself to be perfect. And most importantly, give yourself permission to enjoy the experience while you're learning it. Because that's when caravanning truly becomes something special. And if you want more simple, practical caravanning advice like this, make sure you hit subscribe, because I'll be helping you every step of the way.